Introduction: The Abolition of Animal Use versus the Regulation of Animal Treatment. From the book Animals as Persons, Essays on the Abolition of Animal Exploitation by Gary Francione. In order to understand how we think about animals as a moral and legal matter, both historically and at the present time, it is necessary to consider two different aspects of our relationships with other animals: our use of animals and our treatment of animals. These aspects are different because whether we use animals at all for a particular purpose is a different question from how we treat them pursuant to that purpose. For example, whether it is morally acceptable to kill any animals at all is a different question from how we treat the animals we eat, and whether, for instance, we raise them in intensive factory farms or in free-range conditions, or how we slaughter them. Our use of animals is a separate matter from whether our treatment of them is humane or cruel. Based on this distinction between use and treatment, we can identify four primary ways in which we have conceptualized our moral and legal obligations to non-human animals. Before the 19th century, we generally regarded animals as things, both in moral theory and under the law. According to this view, neither use nor treatment raised a moral or legal concern because animals simply did not matter at all. The animal welfare position, which became popular in the 19th century and represents the prevailing contemporary paradigm, separates use and treatment and holds that it is acceptable to use animals for our purposes. We do, however, have a moral and legal obligation to treat them humanely and to avoid imposing unnecessary suffering on them. The primary focus of animal welfare is the regulation of animal treatment. The animal rights position, which maintains that our use of animals cannot be justified, seeks to abolish all animal use. The abolitionist position rejects regulation on theoretical grounds. Even humane animal use cannot be justified morally, as well as practical grounds. Regulation does not sufficiently protect animal interests and even facilitates the continued social acceptance of animal use. The new welfarist position, of which there are multiple versions, is more or less critical of traditional welfarist regulation, but continues to promote regulation as a means to achieve abolition or significantly reduce animal use and exploitation in the future. Most large animal advocacy organisations promote some version of the new welfarist position. At each stage, our views about supposed cognitive or spiritual differences between humans and non-humans, or the perceived moral significance of those differences, have informed our views about the use and treatment of non-humans. I will now briefly examine these four positions in very general terms, and then describe the essays in this book, which discuss these topics in greater detail. Animals as things. Neither use nor treatment raises a moral issue. Until the 19th century, the Western view was, with few exceptions, that non-humans were completely outside the moral and legal community, and that neither use nor our treatment of them raised any moral or legal concern. We could use them for whatever purpose we wanted, and we could inflict pain and suffering on them pursuant to those uses without violating any obligations that we owed to them. That is, non-humans were regarded as things that were indistinguishable from inanimate objects, and toward which we thus could have no moral or legal obligations. Although we might have a legal obligation that concerned animals, such as an obligation not to injure our neighbour's cow, this was an obligation that we owed to our neighbour not to damage her property, but not an obligation that we owed to the cow. To the limited extent that the cruel treatment of animals was thought to raise a moral issue, it was only because of a concern that humans who abused animals were more likely to ill-treat other humans. Again, the obligation concerned animals but was owed to other humans, and did not recognise that non-human animals had any moral significance. Various reasons were offered to justify the status of animals as things. Some people, such as René Descartes, apparently believed that the animals were, as a factual matter, indistinguishable from inanimate objects, and that animals were not sentient. They were simply not beings who were conscious, had subjective and perceptual awareness, or were able to experience pain and suffering. As a result, they were not beings who had interests, that is, they did not have preferences, wants or desires. According to Descartes, animals were machines that God created and therefore no more conscious than the machines that humans created. If Descartes was correct, non-humans are not sentient and have no interests, then it would not, of course, make sense to talk about having moral or legal obligations to animals concerning our use or treatment of them, any more than it would to talk about our obligations to alarm clocks. Some scholars dispute whether Descartes really believed that animals were not sentient, but if he did, he would have been unusual. At that time, most people did not doubt that animals were sentient and had interests. Rather, they maintained that humans were morally justified in ignoring animal interests and treating animals as if they were inanimate objects, because animals were inferior to humans. This inferiority had two forms. The first is what we might regard as spiritual inferiority. Western civilization has long entertained the notion that humans, or at least some of them, are created in the image of God and have greater value, with some people referring to souls, that justifies excluding animals from the moral community altogether. The creation story in the book of Genesis talks about God giving dominion to humans, a notion interpreted to mean that God authorized the domination of non-humans by humans. Indeed, the English philosopher John Locke, who was central to the development of the modern theory of private property, based the exclusive ownership of property on the supposedly absolute control that God gave us over animals, as described in Genesis. The second form of inferiority is what we might consider natural inferiority, based on the purported lack in humans of some special mental characteristic regarded as uniquely human. According to this view, although animals are similar to us in that they are sentient or consciously aware, their minds are otherwise different from ours. That is, they lack cognitive characteristics possessed by all or most humans, such as rationality, abstract thought, language ability, reflective self-awareness, or the ability to engage in reciprocal moral relations. This qualitative difference between humans and animals, it was claimed, allowed us to ignore animal interests and treat animals as things. For example, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant recognised that animals were sentient and could suffer, but denied that we had any direct moral obligations to animals because they were neither rational nor self-aware. Kant maintained that our treatment of animals was morally relevant only to the extent that it made us more likely to treat other humans in the same callous way. A hybrid version of this doctrine regarded animals as things, combining natural and spiritual inferiority. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas linked rationality with having a soul and saw non-humans both as naturally and spiritually inferior. Although Locke believed that God had given animals to humans for the latter to use, he also maintained that animals were not capable of abstract thought. Indeed, it is accurate to say that during this period, many people linked natural and spiritual inferiority and maintained that animals lacked some supposed uniquely human characteristic, such as rationality or the ability to think abstractly, because they, unlike humans, were not made in the image of God. Therefore, in this phase, which continued through the beginning of the 19th century, we viewed both the use and the treatment of animals as not presenting any sort of moral or legal issue. Animals were considered indistinguishable from machines and not sentient, or alternatively sentient but spiritually or naturally inferior to humans. In any case, humans could use non-humans for whatever purpose they wanted and treat them as they wanted, pursuant to those uses, as long as they did not damage the property of others or engage in conduct towards animals that might make them likely to act in a similarly unkind manner towards other humans. Humans may have had obligations that concerned non-humans, but they did not have any obligations that they owed to them. Animal welfare. We can use animals but must treat them humanely. In the 19th century, as part of the progressive movements in favour of women's rights and in the opposition to human slavery, our thinking shifted to the animal welfare position, which purported to reject the notion that animals were merely things of no moral or legal consequence. Not everyone rejected the Cartesian view that animals were not sentient, or the notion that non-humans, if sentient, were completely outside the moral community because of some natural or spiritual inferiority. Rather, these notions continued to inform thinking about our obligations to non-humans, but the view that animals were at least partial members of the moral community emerged, enjoyed widespread social acceptance, found its way into law, and remains the prevailing contemporary view. The animal welfare position maintains for the most part that we may use animals for our purpose because they are our spiritual or natural inferiors, but they are limitations on our treatment of them. That is, animals are able to suffer whether or not they have souls or some human-like cognitive characteristic. Therefore, we may use animals because they are different from us, but we nonetheless are obligated to treat them humanely and not to cause them unnecessary suffering. We must use animals gently. Moreover, this is a moral obligation that we owe directly to the animals and is not one that merely concerns animals but is really owed to other humans. Among people who were influential in the development of the animal welfare position was the British lawyer and philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who maintained that animals had been degraded into the class of things with the result that humans torment them in various ways. Bentham made it clear that non-humans share to some degree the characteristics regarded as unique to humans, and that in any event, the absence of these characteristics did not grant people a license to treat animals in any way that they wished. A full-grown horse or dog is beyond comparison a more rational as well as a more conversable animal than an infant of a day or a week or even a month old. But suppose the case were otherwise, what would it avail? The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? As long as an animal is sentient, the animal's interests, and particularly interests in not suffering, must be given appropriate consideration. Although Bentham suggested that some animals might be more rational than some humans, he certainly did not reject the position that human minds were qualitatively different from animal minds. On the contrary, Bentham believed that such differences existed, and he maintained that although these differences did not permit us to torment animals, they did allow us to use animals as long as we took care to minimise their suffering. Bentham discussed this in the context of why it was morally permissible to eat animals. He certainly was aware that we did not have to eat animals to survive, but thought that it was morally permissible for us to eat them because they were not self-aware and had no sense of the future. Animals do not have an interest in not being killed and eaten. That is, animals do not care about whether we use them, but only how we use them, according to Bentham. If the being eaten were all, there is very good reason why we should be suffered to eat such of them as we like to eat. We are the better for it, and they are never the worse. They have none of those long protracted anticipations of future misery which we have. He maintained that animals are never the worse for being dead. Therefore, because Bentham believed that cognitive differences between humans and non-humans meant that the latter did not have an interest in their lives, he did not challenge our use of animals, but only our treatment of them. There was a religious dimension to the welfarist position that emerged in the 19th century, in that the dominion that God supposedly granted us over animals was reinterpreted by some as being a stewardship of some sort and not domination. Although our spiritual superiority meant that we could continue to use them for our purposes, God did not give us unrestricted license to their treatment, and thus we had a moral obligation to treat animals kindly. The animal welfare view was eventually incorporated into the law in Great Britain and the United States, as well as other nations, enacted various laws such as anti-cruelty statuses, which purported to require the humane treatment of animals. For the first time we recognised that we had legal obligations that we owed directly to animals. This is not to say that these laws did not also reflect the concern that the cruel treatment of animals would have on the effect of making humans treat one another badly, but it is also clear for the first time animals were seen not merely as things, but as partial members of the moral community who were inherently deserving of some legal protection. Animal welfare laws therefore allow us to use animals, but require that we balance human and non-human interests in order to ascertain whether animal suffering is justified. Even though the animal welfare position ostensibly represents a dramatic departure from the view that animals are merely things, the laws that are enacted in Britain, the United States and other nations have for the most part failed to significantly protect animals. Although the animal welfare position supposedly prohibits the infliction of unnecessary suffering on animals, we do not ask whether particular institutional uses are themselves necessary, because we assume that these uses are acceptable and because our only concern is treatment. It is clear, however, that most of our moral uses are transparently frivolous and cannot be described as involving any necessity. For example, we kill billions of animals every year for food. It is certainly not necessarily for us to eat animal flesh, dairy, eggs or other animal products. Indeed, the evidence is mounting that animal foods are detrimental to human health. Moreover, animal agriculture is an ecological disaster. The only justification that we have for using animals in this way is that we are accustomed to and enjoy the taste of meat and animal products. The welfare position does not challenge our use of animals for food, and says only that we should not inflict more suffering than is necessary when we use animals for this unnecessary purpose. But what does necessary mean in this context, given that no suffering is necessary because we have no need to eat meat or animal products. The central theme of my 1995 book, Animals, Property and the Law, is that because animals are property, they are commodities with only extrinsic or conditional value. The level of humane treatment required under animal welfare laws will, for the most part, be limited to what is required to exploit animals in an efficient manner. We generally protect animal interests only to the extent that we also derive an economic benefit from doing so. For example, we may require that a cow be stunned so that she is unconscious during slaughter, but stunning also reduces damage to the carcass and injuries to the workers from a large moving animal. Although cows have many other interests at various stages of their life and at the time of their death, we do not protect these other interests because we do not derive an economic benefit from doing so. The suffering of producers who make less profit or of consumers who have to pay more for animal products generally outweighs the suffering of the animals, who almost always lose the supposed balance of interests. The result is that even the most humane nations treat animals who are used for food in ways that would be considered torture if humans were so treated. The same analysis applies to our other animal uses. In order to determine what constitutes humane treatment, the law often looks to those who engage in the animal use because we assume that animal users are rational economic actors who would not impose more pain and suffering than is required for a particular use. This, however, reduces animal welfare laws to directives not to treat animals in ways that do not comply with industry or customary standards. Animal welfare laws generally require only that we act as rational property owners and prohibit only those actions that reduce the value of animal property or that have no economic benefit for humans. Just as a rational person would not smash her car with a hammer, a rational farmer would not impose more suffering than necessary on her cow, as both are valuable pieces of property. But as long as pain and suffering are regarded as providing economic benefits to humans and occur within generally recognised institutions of animal use, animal welfare laws usually are silent. Animal exploiters often offer token opposition to welfare legislation and initiatives, but ultimately support such regulation because they have little or nothing to lose and everything to gain. Indeed, their support is usually required for these measures to be successful. If all animal users were perfectly rational and had full information about how particular practices affected animal productivity, we would probably not even need animal welfare laws, because rational users would not impose more suffering than needed for a particular purpose. In certain respects, the regulation of animal exploitation is similar to the regulation of human slavery in North America. Although many laws supposedly required the humane treatment of slaves and prohibited the infliction of unnecessary punishment, these laws offered almost no protection for slaves. In conflicts between slave owners and slaves, the latter almost always lost. Slave welfare laws, like animal welfare laws, generally required that slave owners merely acted as rational property owners, but did not recognise the inherent value of the slaves. Slave owners were, of course, free to treat their slaves or particular slaves better, but as far as the law was concerned, slaves were merely economic commodities with the only extrinsic or conditional value, and slave owners were essentially free to value their slaves' interests as they chose. Just as we are free to value the interests of our dogs and cats and treat them as members of our families, or abandon them at a shelter, or have them killed because we no longer want them. In sum, the animal welfare position, which is the common contemporary paradigm for thinking that our moral and legal obligations to animals, does not question our use per se of animals, but focuses on the treatment of animals we use. Most of us agree with Bentham and the fundamental premise of the animal welfare position that it is acceptable to use animals as long as we treat them in a humane manner. But because animals are property, the standard of humane treatment is generally limited to what can be justified in light of their property status. Although the animal welfare paradigm has prevailed for some 200 years, we are using more animals than ever before in human history, and we still torment them. Animal welfare separates use and treatment and claims to take treatment seriously, but clearly fails on its own terms to protect animal interests in a meaningful way. Animal rights. The primary problem is use, not treatment. The animal rights position, as I have developed it in my introduction to Animal Rights, Your Dog or the Child, and my other work, is that the principal problem is not how we use animals, but that we use animals for human purposes at all. We have no moral justification for using non-humans, however humanely we treat them. To the extent that we do not use animals, it is of course always better to cause less pain than more pain. It is better that a rapist not torture the victim in addition to committing the rape, but just as it is not morally acceptable to commit rape even if you do not torture the victim, it is not morally acceptable to use non-humans as human resources despite how we treat them. The animal rights position rejects the notion that serves as the foundation of the welfarist distinction between use and treatment. That as an empirical matter, animals do not have an interest in whether or not they continue to exist, and have an interest only in being treated well. Non-humans may have a different sense of what it means to have a life than normal human adults do, but this does not mean that they have no interest in continuing to exist, that they are not self-aware and indifferent to whether we use them and kill them for our purposes, or that death is any less harm to them than it is to us. Consider a human who has a transient global amnesia, in which the person has a sense of herself only in the present, and no recollection of their past and no thoughts about her future. This is more or less how Bentham viewed the minds of non-humans, as rooted in the continuing present. Can we conclude that a human with this sort of amnesia has no interest in continuing to live because her mind is different from that of normal humans, who can recall the past and anticipate the future beyond the present instant? Surely not. Although such a characteristic may justify differential treatment for some purposes, it would not justify forcing such a person to be an organ donor as long as we removed her organs with minimal pain or suffering on her part. Similarly, even if non-humans have a sense of themselves only in the present, we cannot assume that they do not value their lives and are concerned only with how we treat them. Sentience, or subjective awareness, is only a means to the end of continued survival for certain beings who have evolved in particular ways that have made a sentience a characteristic to help them adapt to their environment and survive. A sentient being is a being with an interest in continuing to live, who desires, prefers, or wants to continue to live. When a non-human with subjective or perceptual awareness sees another non-human engaged in some activity, the former is aware that that is the latter, and not she who is engaged in the activity. A sentient being is self-aware in that she knows that she is she, and not another, who is feeling pain and suffering. There is no basis for saying that only those who possess the sort of self-awareness that we associate with normal humans have an interest in continuing to live. Just as the purported cognitive differences between humans and non-humans cannot justify our cruel treatment of non-human animals, they also cannot justify our use of animals as our resources, however humanely we treat them. There probably are significant differences between the minds of humans and those of non-humans, given that human cognition is linked so closely to abstract language, and with the possible exception of the non-human great apes, non-humans presumably do not use symbolic communication. It may well be that non-humans do not have intentional states, predicative in the way that human intentional states are, but we cannot conclude from these differences that non-humans do not have cognitive states that are the least equivalent to those of humans. Indeed, it is difficult to explain plausibly a great deal of animal behaviour without attributing equivalent cognitive states to animals. There is, however, a great deal of controversy about the nature of animal minds, and there will always be those who deny that non-humans have any cognitive ability beyond being sentient and subjectively aware. But we do not need to resolve this perhaps unresolvable debate. Sentience is necessary to have interests at all. If a being is not sentient, then it may be alive but does not have interest in that there is nothing that it prefers, desires, or wants. But if a being is sentient, this is sufficient to be self-aware and to have an interest in continued existence. Although whether a being is sentient may not be clear in all cases, such as those involving insects or mollusks, the overwhelming number of non-human animals we exploit are unquestionably subjectively aware and have an interest in continuing to exist, even if they do not have the same reflective self-awareness that we associate with normal humans. The position that cognitive characteristics beyond sentience or human-like versions of these characteristics are morally more important than other characteristics begs the question from the outset: why is the ability to do calculus morally better than the ability to fly with your wings? Why is the ability to recognize yourself in the mirror morally better than your ability to recognize yourself in a scent that you left on a bush? Moreover, there is no logical relationship between differences in cognitive characteristics and the issue of animal use. Although these differences may be relevant for some purposes, consider the case of a severe mentally disabled human. We may not want to give such a person a driver's license because of her inability to drive, but it is her impairment relevant to whether we use her as an unwilling subject in the biomedical experiment or force her to become an organ donor? No, of course not. Indeed, many of us would argue that her particular disability means that we have a greater moral obligation to her, but it certainly does not mean that we have a lesser one. Similarly, the fact that a dog's mind is different from ours means that we do not give the dog a driver's license, but it does not mean that we can use the dog for purposes for which we would not use humans. In sum, we cannot rely on any cognitive differences between humans and non-humans as a basis for treating animals as our property and continuing to use them for our purposes, however humanely we do so. We do not regard it as acceptable to treat any humans as the property of other humans, although there is a great deal of controversy about what rights humans do or do not have, and we may argue about the moral status of human fetuses. We all agree that every person, irrespective of their particular mental characteristics, must be accorded the basic right not to be treated as property of others. We do not question that every human, whether intelligent, gifted, ordinary or mentally challenged, has the right not to be treated as a resource for others. This is not, of course, to deny that human slavery still exists. It does, but no one defends it. This is also not to say that we treat everyone equally. Clearly we do not. We may, for instance, compensate a brilliant musician at a higher level than someone we do with a severe mental disability, but whether or not we agree whether we should allocate resources equally to both, we all agree that neither should be used exclusively as a means to the ends of others. If, as we claim, animals matter morally, then we must apply the principle of equal consideration, the moral rule that we treat similar cases similarly, and ask whether there is a good reason to accord the right not to be treated as property to non-humans as well. The answer is clear. There is no rational justification for our continuing to deny this one right to non-humans, however humanely we treat them. We can of course fall back on religious superstition and claim that animal use is justified because animals do not have souls, are not created in God's image, or are otherwise inferior spiritually. We can, of course, fall back on religious superstition and claim that animal use is justified because animals do not have souls, are not created in God's image, or are otherwise inferior spiritually. Alternatively, we can claim that our use of animals is acceptable because we are human and they are not, which is like saying we are white and they are black, we are men and they are women, we are straight and they are gay. The animal rights position does not mean releasing our domesticated non-humans to run wild in the street. If we took animals seriously and recognised our obligation not to treat them as things, then we would stop producing and facilitating the production of domestic animals altogether. We would care for the ones whom we have here now, but we would stop breeding more for human consumption, and with respect to non-domesticated non-humans, we would simply leave them alone. In the case for animal rights, Tom Reagan also argues against animal welfare and regulation and in favour of animal rights and abolition, but my view and Reagan's differ. Reagan links moral significance with the concept of being a subject of a life, a notion focusing on cognitive characteristics beyond mere sentience and requiring a sort of preference autonomy or the ability to satisfy preferences and not merely to have interests. Although Reagan says that being a subject of a life is a sufficient and not necessary condition of being morally significant, his theory is based in important respects on cognitive characteristics beyond sentience. Furthermore, although Reagan does not deny that non-humans have an interest in continuing to live, he maintains that because of the cognitive differences between humans and non-humans, humans have a qualitatively greater interest in continuing to live than animals do. That is, Reagan believes that in normal case, death is a greater harm for humans than for non-humans because it forecloses more opportunities for a human satisfaction. Reagan's position is problematic, however, because if death is a qualitatively greater harm to humans than to non-humans, then there is a non-arbitrary way to distinguish humans from non-humans for the pursuant of treating the latter as human resources, which Reagan ostensibly rejects. At the very least, if we favour humans over non-humans in situations of conflict, according to a morally relevant distinction between the harm or death to humans and non-humans, we risk resolving all such conflicts against the latter solely on the basis of species. In fact, as a result of our own cognitive limitations, we may not be able to understand the mental processes of other species, including how non-humans regard death. In situations of true conflict, and not when we have manufactured the conflict by bringing animals into existence to use as our resources, we may decide to break a difficult tie and choose the human over the non-human because we simply do not know what death means to the non-human. Conversely, we may also choose the non-human over the human in a situation of genuine conflict. Either choice or a coin flip is morally acceptable. We cannot say, however, that death is a lesser harm to non-humans any more than we can say that a death is a lesser harm to a person with global amnesia than it is to a person without it, or that death is a greater harm to a highly intelligent person than it is to a less intelligent person. Reagan's position on this point is thus problematic for the theory that proposes the abolition of all animal use, and my approach rejects it. New welfarism, a compromise between regulation and abolition. In the 1980s, animal advocates in the United States and Great Britain attempted to formulate a position recognising the limitations of traditional animal welfare regulation, but avoiding a direct acceptance of the rights or abolitionist position. This new welfarism, which I first identified in 1996 in Rain Without Thunder, the ideology of animal rights movement, has several different versions. Regulation as leading to abolition. The first version of New Welfarism claims to seek the abolition of animal exploitation as a long-term goal, but nonetheless advocates the improved regulation of animal use in the short term as a supposed means to the end of abolishing or significantly reducing animal use, by raising consciousness about the moral significance of non-human animals. Although this position has been promoted by many of the large animal protection organisations in the United States and Europe, it has both theoretical and practical problems. As a theoretical matter, if our use of animals is not morally justifiable, promoting more humane exploitation as a means to the end of abolition is unacceptable as a matter of moral theory. For example, if we believe that any form of paedophilia is morally wrong, we cannot, consistent with that position, campaign for the humane paedophilia. In the struggle against human slavery in the United States, many of those who favoured abolition refused to campaign for the reform of slavery because they considered reform as inconsistent with the basic moral principle that slavery was an inherently unjust institution. Similarly, the promotion of more humane animal use is inconsistent with the idea that we do not have a moral right to exploit animals in the first place. As a practical matter, this first version of the new welfarist position, that improved regulation will lead to abolition or a significant reduction in use, also is problematic for at least three reasons. First, animal welfare regulation simply does not provide any significant protection for animal interests in the short term. As I discussed earlier, welfarist regulation generally protects animal interests only in the extent that there is an economic benefit for humans. Regulation that extends beyond this and requires animal interests to be protected when there is no economic benefit involves some recognition that animals have value that exceeds their extrinsic value as property and, depending on how far the regulation goes, represents an incremental diminution of the property status of non-humans. Such regulation is fiercely resisted by both producers who want to keep costs as low as possible and consumers who want to feel good about consuming animal products, but who are generally unwilling to pay for significantly improved animal welfare, particularly when they have been reassured that animals are being treated in ways that do not cause unnecessary suffering. Second, there is no evidence that making exploitation more humane advances toward the abolition of that exploitation. Indeed, the contrary appears to be true. We have had animal welfare laws for nearly 200 years, and yet we now exploit more animals in more horrible ways than at any time in the past. To the extent that animal welfare reform raises consciousness about animals, it merely reinforces the notion that animals are things and that we are entitled to use if our treatment of them is humane, and facilitates the continued acceptance of exploitation, which is characterised as meeting that standard. Third, the phenomenon of new welfarism has resulted in a curious partnership between those who claim to endorse animal rights and institutional animal exploiters, who claim to seek mutually acceptable welfare reforms that the former believes will lead to abolition and that the latter believes will further reassure the public that animal treatment is at a morally acceptable level. But because animals are property, these reforms are necessarily limited to minor changes in animal welfare that in many cases do nothing more than improve animal productivity and increase producer profit. In effect, animal advocates have become advisors to institutional exploiters regarding how they can achieve greater profits by making these minor changes. To the extent that these changes offer any benefits to animals, they are offset by the fact that exploiters can point to the support of animal advocates, which in turn promotes the continued social acceptance of animal exploitation. Indeed, many large animal advocacy organisations actively advertise animal products that supposedly have been produced in a humane manner. Such promotion may actually increase consumption by people who had stopped eating animal products because of concerns about treatment, and will certainly provide as a general matter an incentive for continued consumption of animal products. New welfarism presents a false dichotomy. Even if we embrace abolition as the ultimate goal, we have no choice but to pursue welfarist regulation in the short term, because that is the only realistic strategy that we can pursue, given that animal use will not be abolished anytime soon. Putting aside that welfarist regulation does not significantly protect non-humans in the short term, does not lead to abolition in the long term, and only facilitates social comfort with and the acceptance of animal use as a general matter, this position neglects other choices that are arguably not only more consistent with a theory that rejects animal use as immoral, but whose practical strategy is more effective. A central tenet of my theory is that the rights position offers clear normative guidance for incremental change. On an individual level, the rights position prescribes incremental changes in the form of veganism. Veganism means not eating meat, dairy, eggs, honey and other animal products, or wearing or using animal products or products tested on animals. Veganism, which results in decreased demand for animal products, is much more than a matter of diet, lifestyle or consumer choice. It is a personal commitment to non-violence and the abolition of exploitation. A person who agrees that animal use is not morally justified but who continues to consume animal products is similar to those in 1830 who opposed slavery but continued to own slaves. In a society underpinned by animal exploitation, it is extremely difficult, perhaps impossible, not to be at least indirectly complicit in animal exploitation as consumers, but we can nevertheless be clear that if we are not vegans, we certainly are animal exploiters. Just as the decision to become vegan is the most important incremental change that advocates can make on a personal level, creative vegan education and campaigning are the most important activist incremental activities on a social level. Again, promoting veganism on this level is not merely a matter of influencing consumer choices, rather the focus is on promoting a vision of justice for non-humans as well as humans, many of whom are condemned to starvation because of the inefficient use of resources involved in animal agriculture. It involves recognising that our unjustified exploitation of non-humans is related to our oppression of other humans, and to the discrimination that manifests itself as racism, sexism, heterosexism and other forms of discrimination. Indeed, the concern about justice for non-humans makes sense only as part of a progressive social and political view that values human rights and opposes human exploitation. If we ever hope to shift the paradigm away from the speciesist hierarchy that currently informs our thinking about non-humans, we must develop a political and social movement in favour of abolishing animal use with veganism, as both a logical and a moral matter, being the clear baseline of that movement. Many new welfarists, however, reject veganism as a moral baseline. They maintain that it is more practical to support welfarist reform and to promote animal uses that are more humane. But this approach reinforces the prevailing view that animal use is morally acceptable if treatment is humane, and it makes veganism appear as a radical or extreme response to animal exploitation, which is counterproductive to the goal of abolishing animal use. I have long argued and continue to believe that an afternoon spent distributing literature on veganism at a crowded place or giving a lecture on veganism at a local community college is a much better use of time as a matter of both moral theory and practical strategy than spending that time working on a campaign to get battery hens some extra space, or to require that vivisectors treat animals used in laboratories more humanely. Singer and animal liberation. The second form of new welfarism is the position advocated by Peter Singer. Although Singer is often mischaracterised as an animal rights advocate, he, like Bentham, is a utilitarian who maintains that normative matters are determined only by consequences, and he rejects the concept of moral rights for humans and non-humans alike. Singer's view is also and more accurately described as the theory of animal liberation, presumably reflecting the title of his book, Animal Liberation. Singer agrees with Bentham that sentience is the only characteristic required for animals to be morally significant, and that no other characteristic such as rationality or abstract thought is needed. Singer maintains that we should apply the principle of equal consideration and should treat animal interests in essentially the same way that we would treat the similar interests of a human, and not discount or ignore those interests on the basis of species. But also, like Bentham, Singer regards most non-humans as living in a sort of an eternal present that precludes their having an interest in a continued existence. This position leads Singer to maintain that animal use per se does not raise a moral problem, and so he does not challenge the property status of animals as inherently problematic. Singer therefore accepts the welfarist distinction between use and treatment and claims that the latter is the main issue, in that we should focus more on animal suffering and less, and perhaps not at all, on animal killing, except to the degree that it causes suffering. If Singer is wrong in assuming that animals do not have an interest in their continued existence, then our use of animals in ways in which we do not use humans and our treatment of animals as our property necessarily violates the principle of equal consideration. As discussed earlier, humans who lack the reflective self-awareness of normal adults, such as those with particular forms of amnesia or very young children or those with certain mental disabilities, still are self-aware and still have an interest in continuing to live. There may, of course, be a difference between the self-awareness of a normal adult human and that of other animals, but even if that is the case, it does not mean that the latter have no interest in continuing to live, and it does not justify treating the latter as commodities. Singer begs the question from the outset by maintaining that only self-awareness that matters to having an interest in life is the sort that normal humans possess. Moreover, even if the animals do not have an interest in continued life, the application of the principle of equal consideration to the treatment of animals we still use is problematic for at least two reasons. First, any such endeavour requires that we make interspecies comparisons in order to determine whether the animal interest in question is similar to the human interest and therefore merits similar treatment. This sort of determination is difficult when only humans are involved. Is your interest in not suffering the same as mine? Can you tolerate more pain? It is always impossible when comparing members of a different species. This is an understandable tendency to think that a human interest is always different and more important. Second, putting aside these considerations, assessments of similarity are particularly difficult given the property status of animals. The fact that an animal is property and only has extrinsic or conditional value automatically prejudices us against perceiving an animal interest as similar to a human one. Given the importance of property rights, it should not be surprising that many humans think that any inability to use their property as they wish is a significant deprivation that leads them to discount heavily any animal interests at stake. Indeed, the fact that we consider ourselves to be a humane society, yet we tolerate and support horrible animal suffering for trivial reasons, is proof that the property status of animals is paramount to our perceptions that animal interests are unlike those of humans. If an animal's interest is not considered similar, then the principle of equal consideration does not require similar treatment. And even if we determine that an animal has an interest similar to that of a human, the animal's property status is a good reason not to accord similar treatment to the animal, unless doing so would benefit humans. Because Singer does not challenge the property status of non-humans, and maintains that use per se does not raise a moral issue, his theory is essentially a version of animal welfare. It is arguably more progressive in that it requires that we accord greater weight to animal interests than we currently do, but as a theoretical matter, Singer never explains how to do this, and, as a matter of his individual animal advocacy, he promotes traditional animal welfare reform, such as supposedly more humane slaughtering processes or larger cages for battery hens. In any event, he does not see animal welfare as a means of abolishing animal use, because he does not advocate abolition. Rather, he sees animal welfare as a means of reducing animal suffering. He maintains that we can be conscientious omnivores if we take care to eat flesh and other products made from animals who have been raised and killed in a humane fashion. Singer does claim that if non-humans are sufficiently similar to humans, they may be entitled to greater protection, including not being used as human resources. Singer co-edited The Great Ape Project, Equality Beyond Humanity in 1993, a collection of essays organised around a declaration on great apes, which insists that non-human great apes be included in the community of equals with humans, given rights to life, liberty and freedom from torture. Although I was a contributor to the Great Ape Project, I maintained then and do now that sentience alone is sufficient for the right not to be treated as a human resource. To require that non-humans have minds similar to humans as a condition for not treating them as things reinforces and perpetuates an unjustifiable speciesist hierarchy. Feminist theory and the rejection of rights. The third sort of new welfarism may be found in the writings of certain feminist theories who claim that all rights are patriarchal and reinforce hierarchies, and that we must therefore move beyond rights to develop an ethic of care for our relationship with non-humans. Those who adopt this view reject universal rules, such as an absolute prohibition on the use of animals as human resources, in favour of using values such as love, care and trust to make judgments about animal use in particular situations. Although rights certainly have been used to establish and reinforce a variety of morally odious hierarchies, rights are not inherently patriarchal. Instead, a right is simply a way of protecting an interest. It treats that interest as unviolable, even if the consequences to others are violating it are considerable. Such normative notions are part of feminist theory, and that no feminist of whom I am aware believes that the morality of rape is dependent on a case-by-case analysis in the light of an ethic of care. On the contrary, a woman's interest in the integrity of her body is correctly treated as inviolable. A woman has the right not to be raped, and the ethic of care has nothing to do with this. Similarly, if a non-human is sentient, we have no justification for ignoring the fundamental interests of that non-human and treating her as a resource. The feminist ethic of care does not go beyond rights. Rather, it is a form of welfarist theory which, like Singer's position, seeks to accord greater weight to non-human interests, but still preserves the hierarchy of humans, who, despite what these theorists claim, are accorded protection of their rights that is denied to non-humans. The animal advocacy movement is really two vastly different movements. One sees our use of animals as central and seeks the abolition of animal exploitation through the progressive and deliberate eradication of the property status of animals. The others regard treatment as the primary concern and seeks better regulation of animal exploitation through measures that mainly make animal exploitation more efficient, but do not effectively challenge property status. The essays in this book focus on the inherent tension between these two approaches, the failure of animal welfare laws to provide significant protection to animal interests, and the idea present even in the writing of animal advocates Peter Singer and Tom Regan that issues of use and treatment are properly informed by supposed differences between the minds of humans and those of non-humans. The first essay, Animals, Property or Persons, presents a version of the abolitionist theory of animal rights that I developed more fully in Introduction to Animal Rights, Your Child or the Dog. I argue that our moral thinking about animals is terribly confused, and a large part of the problem is our treatment of animals as property, which cannot be justified morally. I conclude that our acceptance of the right of non-humans not to be treated as property requires that we abolish institutionalised animal exploitation and stop producing domestic non-humans for human use. In the second essay, Reflections on Animals, Property in the Law and Rain Without Thunder, I respond to various critics who argue that the property status of animals is not an unsurmountable obstacle to improving animal welfare, and that animal welfare regulation is an effective way of moving incrementally toward the recognition that non-humans have more than extrinsic or conditional value. In the third essay, Taking Sentience Seriously, I discuss how our focus on whether animal minds are like ours, what I have called the similar minds approach to the human-non-human relationship, has led us to analyse inadequately the moral importance of animal suffering, despite our claim to take it seriously through the prohibition of inflicting unnecessary suffering and the requirement that we treat animals humanely. In the fourth essay, Equal Consideration and the Interests of Non-Human Animals in Continued Existence, a response to Professor Sunstein, I reply to Professor Cass Sunstein, who, in a lengthy review of my Introduction to Animal Rights in the New Republic, claims that I have failed to justify why we should not focus on better regulating our treatment of animals rather than abolishing animal use. In the fifth essay, The Use of Non-Human Animals in Biomedical Research, Necessity and Justification, I discuss how the discourse on the use of animals in biomedical research usually focuses on two issues. The first issue is empirical and asks whether the use of non-humans in experiments is required in order to obtain data. The second issue is moral and asks whether the use of non-humans can be defended as a matter of ethical theory. I argue that although the use of animals in research may involve a plausible necessity claim, indeed our use of animals in this context is our only animal use that is not transparently frivolous. There is no moral justification for using non-humans in situations in which we would not use humans. And with the exception of Singer and a few other utilitarians, almost no one argues that it is ever permissible to use humans in this way. In the 6th essay, Ecofeminism and Animal Rights, I contend that when applied to non-humans who are property, the feminist ethic of care does not provide protection that extends beyond rights. Rather, when so applied, it is a form of new welfarist theory, which, like Singer's position, seeks to accord greater weight to the interest of non-humans, but still preserves the hierarchy of humans, who have rights protection that is denied to non-humans. In the final essay, Comparable Harm and Equal Inherent Value, the problem of the dog in the lifeboat, I discuss Reagan's view that harm is qualitatively greater loss and therefore a greater harm for humans than for non-humans, and that when we must choose to save the life of a human or a non-human, we are morally obligated to save the life of a human. I discuss some of the problems that arise from Reagan's analysis. I have, since writing this article in 1995, decided that Reagan's theory of comparable harm is more problematic for Reagan's theory than I thought initially. Accordingly, I have added some comments as a postscript to this essay that reflect my more recent views. It is my hope that these essays will help sharpen the meaning of animal rights, which has come to be used to describe any normative position that vaguely concerns animals, and to make clear that the rights position means abolishing the exploitation of animals and accepting the personhood of non-human animals. By personhood of non-human animals, I do not mean that we are morally obligated to treat non-humans as human persons. Humans have interests that non-humans do not have, and vice versa. But just as we regard every human as having inherent value that precludes treating that human exclusively as a resource for others, so too do animals have inherent value that precludes our treating them as our property. It is my hope also that my views will inform the debate between the abolitionist and welfare approaches, a debate that is increasingly taking the centre stage in our thinking about the moral and legal status of non-human animals.